Hey y'all, my name's Chris Freeman, and I am working on a little review session for my students for their AP exam. And I wanted to take a little while and just sit here and wax poetic on some invasive species. So there's some interesting stories that can be told that deal with invasive species. And the picture that we're looking at right here is of rabbits in Australia, and they are running amok. And it really gets at quite a few important concepts. So let's dig in a little bit, and hopefully this is review, but it's good to tune in regardless. So rabbits were introduced to Australia quite a while ago, and they it was the perfect habitat for them. And so when we are thinking about native species, usually they have some sort of predator to keep them in check, or there's some sort of balance so that they don't just completely devour all of the food in the area and overtake the place. But when you introduce a species, an invasive like rabbits to Australia, they don't have a natural predator there, and so nothing eats them. And if there's food for them and they're good at getting it, which these rabbits are, then they're going to outcompete their native neighbors. They're going to overtake the food stocks, and in many instances, really deplete the native flora and fauna and cripple ecosystems. And that's really what started to happen in Australia. And they decided they needed to give these bunnies a run for their money. They needed to knock their population down and out. And so they finally found a bunny virus that they could inject into some bunnies and release them and let them just infect each other, and sort of like a bunny version of AIDS, the AIDS epidemic, and really, tried to pass this off across all the bunnies in Australia, and it just backfired. So a huge percentage of the bunnies did die, but there were lots left. So say 10% were left. Those 10% were effectively super bunnies, right? They were not immune to the bunny virus, or they were immune to the bunny virus, and so they were the only other bunnies around. All their other bunny friends and companions had died from this bunny virus. And so, as a result of that, as a result of humans trying to take care of something that was really running amok in their area, we accidentally created the super bunny when they bred. Both pairs passed on the trait of being resistant to this virus, and as a result, their offspring were also super bunnies. And so, these super bunnies again have started to take over Australia, and it did take a little while for their numbers to grow, but because there are strategists instead of K strategists, our strategists have lots of babies, don't really care for their young that much, and since they had no natural predators, their babies actually had a pretty good time of survival. And all of a sudden, rabbits were really taking over Australia again. And so that's a great example of an invasive species. Sort of great, as in like it's really really terrible. And something that we've gone over, but it's just important to think about. You always want on FRQs to be able to, for the AP exam, pull out examples of things if you can. So you want to work in complete sentences, you want to answer the question, but it's nice to have an example to really show your content knowledge. And this also makes me think about the pesticide treadmill, right? Because we can make super weeds too by spraying pesticide on a farm field, or super pests, right? That might kill off some of the organisms that are trying to munch on your leafy greens. But then all of a sudden, a small percentage of them is alive. They were resistant to that insecticide, and those insects mate, and their offspring is resistant. And then when you go back and you spray again, you're not killing off many at all. And you're wondering why. And so you increase the amount of pesticide that you're using, and you spray that, and that kills off, maybe 90%, but it doesn't get all of them. And the ones that were resistant are the ones that are then going to breed again, and their offspring are going to be even more resistant. And so that becomes a cyclical pattern that is really, we've talked about climate change and positive feedback loops. This is sort of this feedback loop that really spirals until you get to this point, whereas if you use any more of this pesticide, it's going to be toxic to humans, or it's going to kill the plants. And so at that point in time, you have to either switch to a different pesticide or come up with another option. And the same goes for herbs, but this sort of bunny virus is a good correlation there to get into some of those other concepts. But let's look at a couple other examples of invasive species. So here, right over here, you see this pretty purple picture of purple loosestrife. And oh, what a beautiful invasive species that is. But it is terrible. As you can see, there was a swamp there with a lot of other species of plants. And purple loosestrife came in, outcompeted, and pushed him out. And so no longer are any other species there. All you have is purple loosestrife, and nothing really eats it. Sure, it looks like this pretty purple field, but that got rid of all the ecosystem function and all the organisms that relied and fed on all these other types of vegetation that were there before. They just don't have that food resource there anymore. And what's interesting with an invasive species, they typically have an ability to, they tend to be like an R strategist. If they're an animal, if they're a plant, they tend to really be able to reproduce well and be hard to eradicate. And so purple loosestrife, you might think, well, just, set them on fire, right? Well, when you set purple loosestrife on fire, it actually germinates. And so it sends its seed up in the plumes of the flame, and wherever its seeds land next, a purple loosestrife will propagate. And so they can send hundreds of thousands of seeds up into the air with fire. It's almost like that's how they can even spread further. So really the only way you can eradicate them is pulling them out by hand, putting them into a black bag, tying the bag off and sitting them out in the sun to bake. And when they release their seeds into the heat, they're already stuck in that bag and there's no way to go. But, if you look at the size of that field, that would be very impractical to do for every purple loosestrife in the U.S. So, another example of a tough to eradicate invasive species, and just not good management options there. Very hard to keep in check. And then we go here to the plant that swallowed the South, kudzu. And as you can see, you have some home that's been completely overtaken, a forest that's been completely overtaken with this kudzu. We brought this into the South because of erosional banks on the sides of roadways, and thought that these plants that grow fast would be able to stabilize and reduce some erosion in the South. And sure, it did a great job of stabilizing those banks. And it also took over everything. And so, purple loosestrife is an example of an invasive species, but kudzu is probably the most famous plant species that is just terrible, and has overtaken a large part of the South. So, referred to as the plant that swallowed the South. So it came originally from Japan. We planted it thinking that it would help with erosion. Sure, it did, but then it overtook other species as well. And then we can jump over here to the zebra mussel, really devastating the Great Lakes. And it is growing so rapidly that it even clogs man-made structures, but it filter feeds and filters out all the good nutrients in waterways. and overtakes a lot of the native organisms there.